everyone. Thanks so much for coming. We're going to jump right in. We're going to lose the Secretary of State a few minutes early, so we'll want to get to you and your questions as soon as we can. First and foremost, welcome to the Think Tent. This in conversation today with the Right Honourable Robert Jenrick MP has been very kindly sponsored by NHBC. We'd love to thank them for partnering with us. You've made this possible. NHBC is the leading warranty provider for new homes, covering over 1.5 million private and affordable homes, and cares passionately about build quality. With over 80 years of experience in the housing industry, NHBC has been sharing its expertise and insights with government to support key policies such as modern methods of construction. So huge thank you to you. An even bigger thank you to Robert, Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government. Robert is Conservative MP for Newark since 2014, and he has been in a bunch of departments and seen a lot of things during his tenure, including the Treasury and being PPS in the Home Office and in Justice. Now he takes on what I personally think is the biggest brief outside of Brexit. I'd argue that it covers the most important public policy area of at least a decade, if not beyond, and that's housing. Brexit is in the headlines, but people feel the housing crisis day in and day out. So my first question to you is, how did it feel to take on this extremely critical public policy brief, and what ambitions do you have for it?
Well, very good. Thank you very much for inviting me here. I was absolutely delighted to be offered the job. It's always kind of a big surprise, and obviously I'm quite young to be doing this. I think I'm the youngest cabinet minister and the first so-called millennial to be in the cabinet. So
you're representing those young people that can't get on the housing ladder?
Yeah, it's housing and avocados. That's definitely the way forward. No, look, for me, this is an absolute dream department to be part of. I was at the Treasury, if you like, on the other side, looking at these housing issues as the minister there who was responsible for infrastructure and housing. So I came to the department with quite clear ideas about what I wanted to do. And like you, I think, share a passion for getting Britain building, getting a much faster and simpler planning system so that we can finally address this huge intergenerational challenge and get properties built. And as I'm sure all of you came to see my speech yesterday, and it was a full house in the main hall, what I've really set out are, firstly, this is a supply side challenge, and so we need to bring forward some very significant changes and improvements to the planning system to make sure that we can unlock land, get homes built where they're needed, ensure a much faster, simpler and preferably cheaper planning system, and by doing that, get closer to that target that we've set ourselves of 300,000 properties a year, which I would like us to meet. I've got lots of ideas on how we can do that, which hopefully we'll get time to discuss.
We'll dig into it.
The second challenge is around home ownership, and I think that after the 2017 general election, as a party, a lot of us reacted to that and the concern that so many younger people, millennials, had chosen not to vote for the Conservative Party by focusing almost exclusively our energies on generation rent and how we can help to make the rental market fairer, how we can give people greater security of tenure, how we can make everyday life simpler and better, whether that's addressing lettings agents' fees or getting pets into properties, those sorts of things. And I suppose I come at this in a slightly different way, in that all of that matters, and I want to take up that with equal fervour to my predecessors, but not lose sight of the fact that I still fundamentally believe that most people want to own a home. And all of the polling evidence suggests that. The people that I know, I think, still believe that. But it's seen as an unobtainable goal. And so I don't want us to shrug our shoulders and say that those young people should just have to put up with their lot, be in rental accommodation forever. We need to match the work that we're doing on trying to make the rental market better with an equal amount of effort, redoubling our effort to finally get people back into homes that they own as well. So we've got some ideas that we've already announced and more that we'd like to do in the future.
So we'll definitely come back to home ownership, especially for younger people, but I want to highlight some of the prominent announcements that have been made during this conference between you and the Chancellor. I would say you could define them as building up and building again. You're liberalizing people's ability to build upwards if they want to add additional stories to their home. And you are allowing people to turn commercial space into homes and not to have to apply for new planning permission. So, I mean, that's a great start. But are these really the big, innovative ideas, the ones that are going to solve the housing crisis? You know, young people don't think they can get on the housing ladder for very, very good reason. The average cost of rent today is a third of a person's salary. It was a fifth only 15 years ago. People cannot afford to save up to get the mortgage. So, I mean, they're good ideas. I think they're moving in the liberal right direction, but are these really the big, innovative policy ideas, or is there something more to come?
Well, I hope these are just the down payment of what we might be able to do in the future, but I wouldn't underestimate them. You know, the first permitted development of commercial to residential has brought over 20,000 additional properties into the marketplace. And that's a really significant contribution to the number of homes that we need to build. These, I think, will take it forward. We're doing two, as you say. One, which is well known and understood and has been debated for a long time, which is the ability to add extra storage to your property. I think that in the modern world, that's really important. It's expensive to move house. As your family grows, the ability to, in a relatively cost-effective way, grow the size of your home at the same time. If you're looking after elderly relatives, people coming to live with you, the ability to get more space, more bedrooms in a much more liberalised way is really important. The second freedom that we've announced is potentially even more revolutionary, and that's the freedom to demolish an office building or commercial building and replace it with residential. And there I think we've learnt some of the concerns about the first permitted development by saying that that's in principle. So we're giving the freedom for a developer to demolish, but they'll still have to work productively with the local community and authority as to what that replacement actually looks like. Is it high quality? Are the homes the right size? Is there a correct parking? What's the facade like? So it's not giving up on local people and communities really being empowered to challenge what the replacement is. But I think in a city like Manchester, or the ones that I know near where I represent in the East Midlands, like Nottingham, Leicester, Derby, there are quite a lot of poor quality, neglected, often empty commercial buildings from the 60s and 70s. And this is offering a real opportunity for developers to come forward, take those down and replace them hopefully with high quality new homes. So I think they are an important step forward actually, but they're not the whole of the answer. In terms of the future of the planning system, we're looking much more broadly than that. And we're going to be bringing forward further proposals. And we're seeing this really through new lenses, which are what can we do for consumers so that people in their everyday lives trying to make changes to their homes, how can we make that system as simple and cost effective as possible? Building upwards it is part of that, but there's more that we could do there. We've said, for example, that we'd like local authorities to meet the deadlines for planning decisions, and we're going to help provide them with extra money for that. But in return for efficiency and the potential to have your fees rebated automatically if the council aren't able to meet those deadlines, so a faster service, more consumer-friendly service. The second stream that we're setting out to achieve is for SME builders, which are absolutely essential to the future of the industry, a much more resilient industry with more competitive industry. So we've got further ideas there on how we can help them to really get a good quality service that they need. And then obviously a stream for bigger developers who do play an essential role in unlocking large parcels of land and getting major developments done. So through those three lenses, we're going to be bringing forward further reforms in the future. And so I hope this will just be the beginning of something much wider than that. So
is it this government's position that the planning system is too restrictive and needs to be liberalised?
Yeah, I think it's I don't think that's disputed, is it? We have a very complex and contradictory planning system, which is a product
for a long time, so it's actually a nice welcome change.
It's come born out of the post-war settlement, and it needs bringing into the 21st century, but it needs to be done in a sensitive way that brings communities along in the process, and that's the approach that I'm certainly going to take. And that's also why, if you notice what we spoke about yesterday, it was both new freedoms but also empowering communities to ensure that homes that do come forward are high quality and in harmony with their local community. So we also said that we've published, in fact, published yesterday, the first national design guide, which is not an attempt to code what all buildings should look like across the country. Of course, you can't do that. It's not a very conservative approach. But that's going to give a model for what good design could look like. And then we're going to ask every community in the country to replicate that, but thinking about what the local people in Essex, in Greater Manchester, in Nottingham, wherever it might be, actually want, so that those new homes come forward in a way which actually works and creates communities, places that people actually want to live in. And I hope that that won't be overly restrictive, because actually by getting certain ground rules down, that people would prefer to live in streets or properties with backs and fronts or street trees, for example, I think that will give developers certainty about what does a development look like, and that will obviously be priced in. Some of those things may have additional costs, but we're not in the business of making properties materially more expensive. But it should make the planning system less divisive, less slow with debates over minor details, and that power for local communities to reject ugly or thoughtless developments, I hope in the longer term will build support for more house building.
I saw Create Streets was very supportive of the plan, which has been advocating for a long time to give local communities that kind of control. If people feel like the houses being built are ones they and their friends want to live in, they're much more receptive. But you speak about the cost of housing. I mean, there are some other pretty startling statistics around it. It's estimated that about 25% of a home right now is the cost of construction. The other 75% is the red tape on top of that developers have to pay. And especially for young people, but the word young is working a lot now. It's basically people aged 20 to 40 that feel like they can't get on the housing ladder. Knowing that 75% on top of the construction is stopping them from doing so is quite frustrating. So in what other areas do you think we might see the government moving into to cut some of that red tape to make it easier to build?
Well, the main thing, setting aside red tape, is obviously unlocking more parcels of land. But in terms of the planning system, we would like to make it simpler and faster and cheaper if we can do. We're looking, for example, at conditions, how you can reduce those so that it's just simpler to get building, particularly for smaller builders. We're looking at how you can tackle pre-commencement conditions, so it doesn't make a lot of sense that you have to agree and demonstrate the roof tiles that you're putting on a house before you've even put a shovel in the ground. We think there's quite a lot of work that you can do there, and there is evidence that some of these things have got out of hand over the course of the last 20 years. But obviously we're going to protect environmental standards and building safety, which is very important to us. But I think there is quite a lot of work we can do in that area to make the system easier.
Will you be looking at the green belts? It has been for a long time politically untouchable for many parties to talk about building on the green belt, but so much of the green belt isn't really green. It's estimated that a third of green belt around London is actually intense agricultural land or dump sites. They're not actually places that you think of in terms of your gardens or your parks or your beautiful green space. And if you built on just 3.7% of the green belt around London's train stations, you could build 1 million new homes. Isn't it time, especially if we want to get more homes built, that we tackle this issue?
Yeah, well, we've chosen not to do that. We have chosen to go for building on brownfield sites, for greater liberalisations like the freedoms you've spoken about to build upwards, densification in urban areas. And I think if you look at, say, the Prime Minister's record as Mayor of London, where he was able to do all those things and be very strongly pro-house building and get results, it is possible to do that. And of course I hear the arguments, and you're absolutely right that some parts of the Green Belt are not particularly beautiful, but it's not our priority to take on that issue. I think there's a lot more work that we could do in terms of liberalising the planning system and getting sites where there's a much higher degree of public support and consensus going. So that's certainly going to be my focus.
Do you think that the target of 300,000 new homes is enough? Most estimates say that we need 1 million to actually tackle the cost of housing and bring the cost of housing down. And not to harp on the green belt too much, but is there enough space for 1 million new homes in the areas that you're targeting with brownfield and the rest?
Well, 300,000 homes per year.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure if there's anyone arguing about building 1 million homes a year.
I think the thought is you need 1 million homes now to start tackling the housing crisis meaningfully.
But that's different than being able to deliver 1 million homes in a single year. 300,000 is actually a big target. You know, last year we built 220,000 homes. That's more homes than any year bar one in my adult lifetime. This year will be significantly better than that. It may be around 240 or 250,000 properties. So these are large numbers of homes coming forwards by the standards of our lifetimes. But clearly we do need to go significantly further than that. And we need to ensure there's a proper mix of those properties as well. And that's one of the challenges, both homes to purchase, homes to rent, and within that mix, the right mix of properties for young people all the way up to bungalows and properties for older people to live in as well. And so we mustn't lose sight of that. But I mean, I think 300,000 is a reasonable target. I mean, it's a moving feast and it's linked to affordability. So, but that's still what we're going to shoot for.
Yesterday we heard the Chancellor announce that devolution will be an area that he's going to be looking at through a new white paper. And I don't think you can separate devolution from the housing crisis because, as we were saying before, local communities need to be bought in to what's going to be in their areas, but also they need to be incentivized, possibly fiscally, in order to get those new homes built. So what role do you see for devolution in your brief?
Well, my department is in charge of getting more mayors and greater decentralisation going across the country. I was always an advocate of it, but I have to confess when I was first elected, I was doubtful of the role that mayors could bring in some parts of the country, like where I represent, which is quite a disparate area in the East Midlands. Having now been in Parliament longer, and particularly my experience in the Treasury, dealing with the mayors that we have across the country on a cross-party basis, I am now very strongly in favour of them.
You're a convert.
I have been converted. I think that they make a huge difference in giving real leadership, strategic leadership to an area. I've been very impressed by some of the mayors and the work they've done in transport, in infrastructure, in inward investment, and in housing. So I would strongly encourage more parts of the country to take forward the mayoral model, and the Prime Minister's message from his first speech here in Manchester just after his election was that we are in the business of trying to sign more deals. We've made an open invitation to any part of the north already, and Chancellor said yesterday essentially that that offer is extended to the whole of England. And so my role is to get out and bring the same kind of energy and enthusiasm that there was to that agenda in the George Osborne period just a couple of years ago. And we're already in discussions with a number of really important parts of the country, such as Leeds and West Yorkshire, which is a missing link already in the devolution picture. So
if you're
I'd
really
like
on
to get
board,
more done.
which is fantastic, how far would you take it? Are you convinced enough that you think that further tax powers should be devolved to these regional areas? Would you ever even consider maybe allowing corporation tax to be devolved in order for these northern communities to recruit business and actually compete with London for the first time in a meaningful way?
Well, what we've said we're going to do is extend an invitation to come to us and try to get deals done, to level up the powers of all the mayors that currently exist to the same power as Andy Street enjoys here in Manchester, with the exception of health and social care, where we think we probably have to tread a bit more carefully and see how successful that's been in Manchester before extending it, but certainly possible once I think we've learnt more about how well that's gone. And we're going to be bringing forward proposals in a white paper later this year, I hope, which will set out some of our principles on what devolution could look like into the future. And all the mayors I've spoken to, including Andy Burnham, but many others in the last couple of weeks, I've said to them, come forward to us with your ideas on what you think would make a real difference, and we'll listen to them very seriously. I mean, in terms of fiscal powers, well, that's I guess, a question for the Chancellor, but one of our core principles of devolution is that it has to come with accountability. So it's all well and good asking for more money, but it only works in the long run if people can really hold you to account for the decisions that you're taking. And I'm sympathetic to arguments like that, because that is an obvious way in rooting mayors with their population and making them truly accountable. And in this country, we haven't yet got there.
No.
So if you look at when Crossrail got into difficulties with its building costs, Sadiq Khan was on the phone to me and Philip Hammond at the Treasury asking for a bailout. And so there isn't yet the level of accountability that you would see in the US, for example, where states and governors and...
Or even in Europe.
Much more accountable.
Yeah, despite the devolution that has occurred to Scotland and Wales, the UK is one of the most centralised systems in all of Europe, so there's a lot more that can be done. And I should flag any questions that we do have for the Chancellor we can ask at 5:45 this afternoon.
There you go.
He's also in the think tent. Speaking of local communities, the High Street is also a major talking point at the moment when we're not talking about Brexit. And I was wondering what your take on it was as online shopping is just transforming the way that consumers purchase their goods. Do you take a more protectionist stance towards the High Street? Are you fine and comfortable with a total transformation of what's there and how people are currently living their lives? Or are you somewhere in between?
Well, I was involved very heavily in this before the last budget, and we had choices about what we did to respond on the High Street. And I suppose I took the view that high streets are very important because they are the centre of communities. They are places where people can still come together. You can meet your neighbours. And I mean, I represent somewhere now, a very historic market town, but one where people are leading very busy lives. 80% of my constituents commute more than 10 miles to work. Without the town centre, you don't really have anything that fundamentally brings the community together. So I'm a strong supporter, but I'm also a realist that people's patterns of living and shopping have changed fundamentally. And although there does seem to be some evidence that Generation X are returning to the high street, I'm told, I don't think you're going to go back to the way it was before. So the task of government is to help high streets to adapt and evolve rather than to try to turn back the tide. And so that's the approach that we've taken more recently. We've created our High Streets Fund, which is very much about how you can use investment from the state partnered with the private sector to help high streets and town centres to make that evolution work as smoothly as it can do. And I don't underestimate how difficult that process is. And so that fund is very much focused on the things we know could help town centres. How can you get significantly more housing into town centres, both for young and old people? How can you get more workspaces into town centres so there's more vibrant and footfall going on there? And how can you make them centres of leisure, tourism, and destinations, all the things that are, as far as we can tell, very likely to proceed long into the future.
It does seem that people are more interested in receiving services from the high street now than they are goods. There has been some pushback on houses on the high street in fear that they might just turn into residential areas, but it's good to hear that the government's open to those ideas. I mean, how much should the government be leading on this, and how much should it be taking its cue from what people's activity actually is, despite what the government might want them to do?
Well, I think you've got to be led by consumer habits, haven't you? And that's why I think we have taken this approach that there's no kind of King Canute, turn back the tide, just pretend that the internet didn't exist attitude. That's not going to work. It will only at best hold back the inevitable for a short period of time at great expense. So what we're doing is, I hope, moving with the times and allowing town centres to adapt at the same time. The success of our High Streets Fund will be very interesting because that's really a challenge for local communities. And they're going to be bidding in at the moment for up to £25 million each of investment. Hopefully that will be able to crowd in even larger sums from the private sector. And from that I think we'll learn quite a lot about what actually does work, where good councils can make a difference, and where the private sector will have a crucial role to play. And we're very keen for this not to be totally led by local councils, but actually to see what the private sector can really do to make a difference, and whether there are further planning reforms that you can do to help people to assemble land, to regenerate, to get housing into town centres. All that, we're very interested in people's thoughts.
Your quick leap to becoming Secretary of State for such an important brief is impressive on its own, but you have held a variety of different briefs in different departments now. So the last question I'm going to ask before I go to the floor is, what one or two standout policy changes have you been a part of so far that you're most proud of?
Oh, well, I've only been a minister for less than 2 years, so I suppose the thing I was most proud of was at the Treasury, where I persuaded Philip Hammond to scrap PFI. So we had debated that for a very long time as a country. I'd seen it in my own area as being incredibly damaging to our local hospital, and I was pleasantly surprised when we put forward the proposal to Philip that he took it up and was willing to retire PFI, and I hope that future governments don't make the same mistake again.
Well, it's crony capitalism, isn't it? Yeah, it's...
well, it was, all the evidence was it was poor value for money, and other than the balance sheet considerations, there was no good argument for it. So that I think was a good step forward.
That's a good answer. All right, I'm going to go to the audience, take a few questions. I'm going to take 2 or 3 at a time so we get through them. I'm going to start with NHBC, our very kind sponsor, and then I'll take some hands from the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Lewis Sidnick from NHBC. I wanted to ask about building safe homes. It's clearly a primary importance, and NHBC is really supportive of the work that you've done and the Building a Safer Future consultation and work along those areas. And on the ground, we carry out over 1 million inspections of new homes a year. But I think there's big challenges that remain. What is your view? You're new to the post. What's your view and impression about the challenges that remain, and how do you see things progressing in this area? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just take a few more, and then we'll get as many in as possible. Gentleman in the back in the pink shirt.
Thank you. Steve Harrod. I'm a member for Chalgrove and Watlington in South Oxfordshire. And I'm interested in your views about the mayoral system. How do you feel about unitary government?
Thank you. And lady on the end.
Thank you. I'm Lana Hempsel. I'm the planning portfolio holder in Broadland in Norfolk. Robert, your by-election was the first grown-up by-election I ever took part in, so congratulations for getting it.
Thank you.
My question
I wouldn't call it grown-up by-elections. There's no
my
such thing as a grown-up by-election.
You know, it's my terms. Anyway, my question is going to bring you into a bit of a corner of your brief that you may not be that familiar with. The Environment Secretary has reviewed or commissioned a review of national parks, which you will know are local planning authorities in their own right. Now, in my mind as a local councillor, I think that being rooted in accountability in local elections is a really important part of being a local planning authority. Yet in his review, the Environment Secretary is proposing that all national parks are centrally led by Secretary of State appointees only. Has this change crossed your desk in any shape or form? Because I think it takes away from what is an essential ingredient of being a local planning authority when all planning decisions then become centrally made by Secretary of State appointees.
Thank you.
Very good.
Great. 3 excellent questions on safety, on devolution, and on the central planning of national parks, really any element of our planning system.
Yeah, very good. Well, perhaps on your question on national parks, I've seen the report that's come out, and I haven't read it yet, but I will take your points into consideration there. I think that's very valid. Perhaps you and I can speak afterwards on that. With respect to building safety, I mean, this isn't an issue that I'd given a huge amount of thought to prior to having this job, but I have to say it's taken up a very large amount of my time since and has given me quite a few sleepless nights. I think it is a huge challenge for the country, and there is a lot of work to do. You know the steps that we're taking as a government. We commissioned the Hackett Review, which I think was a good piece of work. We've accepted the findings, and we're going to be bringing forward legislation. We said that we'll be publishing that, I think, at the end of this year. Obviously, the parliamentary pressures don't help that, but as soon as there's any sense of stability, and we're able to bring forward that legislation and get that on the statute book, of course we will do. There's broad cross-party support, so I don't think, even in the present circumstances, that would be a particular challenge. I think we're doing the right things, but pace is the real challenge. That it's very hard to look somebody in the eye and say, why is there still so much ACM cladding on buildings all this time after the Grenfell fire? Or to speak to people who live in buildings which have some other form of cladding or are concerned about the safety of their building, and not to be able to explain with the greatest degree of certainty what they should be doing. And so I think there's a lot more that we need to do, and to, I suppose, to provide reassurance, I'm taking this very seriously and trying to do what my predecessor was doing and more faster. And so the steps that we've taken so far are, we've got this fund to remediate the cladding on the remaining buildings that haven't taken it off for ACM. We're really putting pressure on the people that own those buildings to get it done. I think now that the taxpayer is paying for that, there is absolutely no justification whatsoever for further delay. And I've said that if in a couple of weeks or so we don't have a clear plan for every one of those privately owned buildings, then we're going to get, I'm afraid, into the business of naming and shaming who owns those buildings and asking them to explain very publicly why they're not taking further action. We're coming to the end now of the testing process that's been done by government of all the materials for which there was a degree of public concern. That process is being done by our independent panel. They're then going to report back to us, and so by the end of the autumn we should be in a position to update any of the advice notes that we've put out over the course of the last couple of years, and they should be in as clear a position as possible. I appreciate, from what you read in the press, that people read them and don't think that they provide the degree of certainty that they would like. We need to make sure that's right, so that we end this year with good quality, crystal clear advice as to what building owners should be doing. And of course those building owners need to get on and do those changes. The other thing, that the step that I've taken personally, is that I wasn't comfortable that we didn't have a very clear sense of which buildings were unsafe in this country. And so we got funding off the Chancellor in the spending round to create a protection board, which is now going to set fire authorities and experts with a consistent methodology out across the country on a priority basis, doing inspections of any building for which they have concerns, which will not all necessarily be high-rise. There might be buildings which are lower, which they might have some reason to be concerned about. And then that will bring forward evidence that will be shared with the people who live in those buildings as soon as possible, and then again action needs to be taken. And that I think will finally give a degree of reassurance to people who are concerned in advance of the end state, which is after we've legislated and the proper long-term solution is in place. So I think there's a lot more work, and those of you who work in the industry or in insurance, we all need to work together to resolve this, because I think it's a huge challenge which most people don't even appreciate the scale of.
Great. Hands up high.
Oh, so do you mind if I just answer
yes,
the gentleman from
back, yes.
South Oxfordshire? So remind me of your question about mayors, I think.
I like the idea of mayors. Yeah. What about unitaries?
Unitaries, sorry, sir. Yeah, well, look, I think that, I appreciate the fact that people want to have a sense of identity, and the small scale brings with it, a closer connection with local communities. But it doesn't feel to me as if that's got a long-term future. I represent a constituency in which there are 3 small district councils. I love all of them and the councillors who are part of that, and I appreciate the upheaval, but I do think we need to move towards a model where it provides better value for money for taxpayers, and you're able to look much more strategically at these challenges like housing and transport. So I will certainly be encouraging local councils to move in that direction.
Hands up high and quick questions. Woman over here in the black shirt.
Hi, my name's Amy. I'm here from St Mungo's, the homelessness charity. I wanted to ask if you could respond to the new data from the ONS this morning that showed that 726 people died while sleeping rough last year, which is a 22% increase on the previous year. and what more the government plans beyond the rough sleeping strategy to end rough sleeping.
Great. Pass the mic down to the woman in the printed top.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Hattie and I'm here on behalf of the Airbnb. It's a question about the short-term rentals market. You may have seen last week, Airbnb basically said it would be open to a registration system of short-term rentals in the UK in different cities. We're going to go around to those different cities, talk to local communities. Question really is basically whether the issue is on your radar. Has it come across your desk so far?
That's great, and just pass it one forward.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm a developer from Bath, and one of the hated few probably. What we need, we're trying to get youngsters, because we need to build more houses. We haven't got the people, or some of the people have gone back home. We are needing help from the government to bring these people through. The trouble is, through a Labour government, they've all been led to believe they should go to university. That's not wrong, but some people it just doesn't suit, and some people are best suited to other things. And as I'm coming through, I'm not going to university myself and owning my own company, I think it's good to bring people through. We are not having the help at the moment to try and get these people to come through. We'd like to see a little bit more support from the government.
Thank you, sir. Just pass that back to Jamie there. So 3 very important questions in terms of rough sleeping and homelessness. And are people being displaced from social housing because of the housing crisis? Essentially, everyone gets displaced. Those who should be in social housing are on the streets. Those who should be in private accommodation can't afford it and are in social housing. So to those significant numbers out today. The short-term rentals market, I mean, we've seen certain countries throughout Europe and even cities really trying to crack down on the short-term rentals market. Does the UK, do you have a perspective on that, and are there any plans to pick that up? And to this very important question about labor and skills, I think that it's twofold really. First of all, as you say, some people are going back home, I imagine, to other countries as well. So, yeah, so especially after Brexit, where's that labor going to come from? And things like the apprenticeship levy, which actually have seen the number of apprentices drop since they came in. Are we stopping ourselves from being able to hire that skilled talent? In your own order.
Okay, well, to the gentleman spoke about skills, absolutely agree with you. We've got to get more young people in this country to be interested in going into the construction industry. I think actually modern methods will be part of the answer to that, because it's going to be such an exciting industry to be part of. Very different from the old construction industry. You know, you'll have people working indoors if that bothers you. Much more tech focused. I think there's lots of opportunities for female construction workers for the first time. You're already starting to see that through, you know, some of our biggest construction projects, whether that's Crossrail or Thames Tideway, have really got good numbers on women coming through. I think there's more that we can do together, but one of our focuses will be on modern methods of construction, and that, I think, will be part of the answer to getting the skills base that we need. In terms of your question on Airbnb, well, look, I'm not anti-Airbnb. I've always been a big supporter of the gig economy and want to see more of that. I want to see choice and people getting into business with micro businesses. So I'm not going to do anything that unnecessarily penalises you, but I do think there's got to be fairness. And it isn't fair what we're seeing in some parts of busy cities like London, where people can, you know, save up, work hard to get a flat, and then find that their whole building is totally different to what they imagine it being, because it's full of, you know, transient people coming and going. I've lived in one of those flats myself, and so I think there should be a fair system where there's transparency on what's, you know, what owners are actually doing. So I'm very happy to work with you and see, you know, I'm pleased to hear the interests and proactive approach that you're taking there.
Pleased to hear you're a fan of the gig economy. We need more millennial secretaries of state, I guess.
Yeah, let's trust. It's at least 2 of us.
That's true. She does call herself the freedom fighter.
Then the important question about the statistics today on rough sleeping, and thank you very much for what St Mungo's do. Well, obviously, like everybody, I was disappointed and very sad to see those statistics. We're going to take forward the rough sleeping initiative. The good news is that that is working. The statistics, as you probably know, show that where that's been in operation, it's seen a reduction in rough sleeping numbers of about 29%. We've also done some research since those figures internally, which has suggested it's slightly higher than that, and it's now around 33%. So that initiative is having a big impact. Overall, rough sleeping, there's been a modest fall, as you probably know, around 2%. but we'd like to go much further than that, obviously. I think all of us would agree it's shameful to walk around any of our cities like Manchester and see people living rough on the streets. And so I'm certainly going to be taking it forwards, working with Luke Hall, the Minister responsible. We secured further funding from the Chancellor in the spending round to keep that going, and in fact to increase its scope. As I say, it is positive that we appear to know what works now, and there's clearly some excellent initiatives that are part of Rough Sleeping and other organisations, but they need to be rolled out in more parts of the country, and those parts of the country where it isn't working, and there are cities who are not succeeding, I mean Birmingham for example, it's not going in the right direction there. We need to be much more aggressive in terms of focusing our energies as a department and with working with charities and other organisations to make an impact. But you certainly have my 100% commitment to taking this forward in the same way that James Brokenshire, my predecessor, was very passionate about moving forwards with it.
We've got time for 2 more questions. Hands up high. Woman on the end.
Hello, my name's Sarah Winston. I represent the non-combustible insulation industry. I know we met in your previous position at Treasury. Basically, it's a massive issue about quality of housing in this country. So we fully understand and welcome, obviously, all this, 300,000 homes, but quality is an issue. And this needs to be combined with the target for net zero as well, because 1/3 of our carbon emissions come from our buildings in this country. So we have to deal with the fabric. Also, moving away from gas to electrification will actually increase bills for consumers within their homes. If you don't have the right fabric in your building, your bills will go up, full stop. So how, as actually, obviously with housing, how is that going to change?
Very good. Shall I just answer that question quickly?
Sure, please do.
Yeah, well, when you and I met when I was working at the Treasury, as you know, I worked with Philip Hammond to create the Future Home Standard that we announced at the Spring Statement. I was a strong advocate of that. We were concerned about whether it would harm supply, how builders would react. Actually, builders reacted very positively, and so in my new role, we've taken that forward, and I've worked with the department to push it onwards, and we've published the consultation now as to what that should look like, and we brought forward some of the measures beginning next year, as you may have seen. So I'm certainly going to be moving forward with that, and that means that no new home will be built from 2025 without the highest levels of energy efficiency, which would be good for your industry and anyone else, and as you say, good for getting people's bills down. I think modern methods of construction will help with that, including for people on the lowest incomes. I went to a great housing association a few weeks ago, Accord in Walsall, who are building exclusively modern methods, very high levels of energy efficiency, and they found a 1/3 reduction in rent arrears for all those properties because energy bills are so low. You give people on a low income a degree of disposable income that they just didn't have before. There is a huge challenge about the existing stock of properties, and that, ask the Chancellor about that. That is one of the biggest and most expensive challenges of meeting our net zero commitment. I think the Committee on Climate Change said that over a 30-year period it would be something like I forget the exact figure, something like £10 billion a year. So, very, very big sum of money, and logistically very difficult. Just think about the challenge of going into people's homes, elderly people's homes, convincing people to do something that's expensive and inconvenient for which they may not see the benefits. But that will be one of the big challenges that I will certainly have to grapple with the Chancellor. We have looked already and begun the process of looking at what other countries are doing. You can see countries like Germany that have experimented with schemes like low interest or zero interest loans. There's a range of precedents. Some have been more successful than others, and we will certainly be thinking that through and trying to come forward with proposals. It looks like you have some in your hand. Okay, absolutely. Yeah.
You can hand deliver it at the very end. Last question in the front row here.
John Gagan, Planning Magazine. My question is about permitted development.
Yes.
So the government yesterday announced more permitted development rights for upward extensions. There's been lots of concerns in the built environment sector about the impact of permitted development on housing quality. The government's very focused on improving the beauty and quality of new housing. I know the government's reviewing this issue about the quality of housing produced under permitted development. So can you say how this review is going to address those concerns about housing quality?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, it's difficult for me to tell you what we're going to conclude at the end of the piece of work that we've done, but that is very much looking at the first permitted development, office to residential, and assessing the evidence as to that, you know, whether there obviously are examples of poorly constructed homes that have come out of that, homes which are very small. I mean, there are even examples of homes which don't have any windows, or only, you know, a very, very, you know, small number. And so there are some very bad examples. On the other hand, as I said earlier, there's many good examples that have come out of it, and it's helped us to bring a large number of properties onto the market that just wouldn't have been there otherwise. We also want a market which is led by, you know, consumers and choice, and there are lots of people, particularly young people, who might choose to have a small home as their first property, or they might make a choice to have a small flat in central London versus a more generously sized one a bit further out of town. So I'm not in the business of limiting the market. You know, people should be able to make choices, but we are going to use that to look at whether there is evidence on a material level of poor quality properties that have come on, the sorts of properties which will not be homes built to last and which will be problems that future generations will have to deal with. As I said earlier, for this new permitted development of demolition to rebuild, we have sought to do this in a different and perhaps more sensitive manner, which is that it will be in principle, and then there will be hopefully a productive discussion with local authorities about what should the facades look like, what's the quality, is there correct parking, all those sorts of things that matter to people. We don't want that to lead to local authorities gumming up the system and unnecessarily preventing developments from happening, but we do want it to mean that those developments are sensitive and good quality. So hopefully that is a sensible, reasonable way to take permitted development forward, but in a way which meets some of the concerns that have been raised in the past.
Very comprehensive answers to some very specific and tough questions. Thank you. Robert unfortunately has to leave us a bit early, so I'll do housekeeping now. We have a few more panels in the think tent today before we all wrap up Party Conference. One on trade after Brexit with Liam Fox and Matt Ridley at 3:15, and we're hosting the Chancellor at 5:45 in the think tent. I think this will be quite popular, so come early. As well, if you've enjoyed this, if you think you might enjoy more thoughts and chats from the IEA, please be sure to sign up to our new book club, a new initiative that we've just started. You can get our pamphlets over there. A huge thanks to NHBC for being such a wonderful sponsor. We couldn't have done this without you. The biggest thanks, of course, goes to Robert. Please keep defending the young avocado eaters. We appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. No, my pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.